3,402 pages across 8 books with 28 hours of audio booking. A lot lower stats than I've had previously, but I had a fantastic January reading month. For my genres, I read 1 contemporary, 1 non-fiction, 1 historical fiction, and 5 fantasy. For the nationalities, I had 3 Americans, 1 Japanese, 1 Welsh, 1 Irish, and 2 English. And for the formats that I read these books in, I read 2 books via hardback, 2 via paperback, 1 via audiobook, and 3 a mix of audiobook and physically reading. No one's going to be surprised here, my biggest book coming in at 819 pages is Winter of the World by Ken Follett. This is a chunker. And my oldest book is Earthsea, the first 4 books in the series by Ursula Guin, which was first published in 1984. So now we've done the stats, let's dive into the reading. So the first book that I read in 2025 was The Haunted House on Hollow Hill by Landy. Now this was kind of a reread because I listened to this originally when it came out in its original podcast form, which was absolutely fantastic, by the way, the production on that. Mwah. This is slightly different. It has some extra characters in, which leads to a slight different plot line, which I thought was a really interesting way of doing both productions, and I really enjoyed this. No one is surprised, I adore Skulduggery Pleasant. This one you can read without having read the rest of the series, so if you want to do the free podcast or if you want to pick this book up, we're following a skeleton detective, Skulduggery, and his partner, Valkyrie, and they are going to a haunted hotel in the middle of England and trying to solve a murder that has magical aspects to it. It's a lot of fun. Then something a little bit different, and this is Outrage by Ellen Jones. This was sent to me by the wonderful folks over at Book Break and is a non-fiction all about LGBTQ+ rights and how the fight for equality is not yet over. This is a very interesting book. It is very focused on the UK, so any Brits watching, this is very good for us. Whilst there are some things that are fairly obvious, that I think we all have been able to see have been issues lately, for example the transphobia that has been massively heightened, and that is mentioned in here. There are also a lot of other things that if you're not directly in that community, hello, you might not know. This was really educational, really well written. I think it's separated into sections very well done. At the end of each chapter there is then a section on what you can do about it and people highlighting people who are already activists in this area, so it gives you direction for how you can assist and also points out some fantastic people. So I think this is a brilliant book. I really do recommend picking this one up. I may grab myself a finished copy at some point because yeah, this is a really important addition to my shelves. Then back to Discworld, and I read Jingo by Terry Pratchett. This is book 21 in the Discworld series. I am definitely losing track, and I enjoyed this one just as much as all of the others, obviously. This is a City Watch book, and in this, between 2 countries, so between Ankh-Morpork and another country, a landmass has risen and they are all going to war over it. So it discusses loyalty to your country and patriotism alongside xenophobia and the idiocy of going to war in the first place. As always, Pratchett has every single topic of discussion you could think of on a situation, squeezed into this one tiny book. I adore Discworld so much. I loved seeing how Vimes was trying to deal with all of this and how the Patrician was dealing with it as well. This series is just so fantastic. Then I dove into Earthsea, which I had somehow never read before. Don't know how it's taken me this long, but yes, Earthsea by Ursula Guin. This is the first 4 books in the series. A Wizard of Earthsea, The Tomes of Atuan, The Farthest Shore, and Tahanu. This was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. These books are quite short, obviously there's 4 of them in here, and I really enjoyed delving into this world and seeing more of Ged throughout his entire lifetime. I feel like that isn't something that we usually get from a series. We usually follow a more condensed span of time, whereas this is following Ged from his youngest days to some of his oldest. I really enjoyed this series. I was expecting to just pick it up and just kind of get through it. Why do I keep doing that? I have these books on my shelf for a reason. I said the same thing for All Quiet on the Western Front, where I was just reading it to get through a classic on my shelf and then I ended up loving it. These are on my shelves for a reason. This is really fun. I really enjoyed the use of magic in here and the talks about morality and the way that different topics are brought up and discussed. I I see why it's a classic now. One I really genuinely was expecting to dislike, and I didn't, and I'm very pleased about this. It's one of the few books that are on my shelves that I wouldn't have kept on my shelves if there wasn't another reason for it. This one is that I was reading Fall of Giants by Ken Follett and was trying to find the other books, and my dad worked really hard to help me find second-hand copies of them, and he was so excited when he'd found them. So I've kept this one and also Edge of Eternity, but in January I read Winter of the World by Ken Follett and actually really enjoyed it. If you've seen my very hated video on Pillars of the Earth, he, in that book, was writing women really, really poorly, and Fall of Giants wasn't great, but it was better than Pillars. This one, pretty decent. Improving. He's improving over time. Glad to see it. Very glad to see it. So whilst there were some bits, a lot of them were self-aware, which I can deal with. So it was done much better than it had been previously. But to explain what the hell this series is about, there's 3 books. The first book is World War I, second book is World War II, and the third book is the Cold War. And we follow characters and their relations throughout this time period as ordinary people across the world lived through these events. It is incredibly well researched. I will always say that for Ken Follett, regardless of what I think about the actual book. The research done on it is incredible and very, very accurate. I learnt some new stuff in here. I think that the points of view are really well chosen. I went into this book expecting to slog my way through it, and instead found myself utterly absorbed. Now, it still took me the majority of the month. I was realistic about how I was going to get through this, but I found myself absolutely absorbed by this book, and I'm really excited to get to Edge of Eternity now, and I'm debating whether I get to it sooner or later this year. But my first book for the 10 books that I must read in 2025 went off fantastically. Then I picked up We Hunt the Flame by Hafsah Faizal. This is my second book from this author, but I've owned this for longer than I had A Tempest of Tea, and I really needed to get around to it. Thank you so much, Carrie from Caring for Books, for gifting this one to me. This is very interesting. We have primarily 2 points of view. One is from a young woman who goes hunting to help people survive and eat in her village, and she pretends to be a man because women aren't supposed to hunt. And there is a man who is the son of the Sultan, but he is essentially used as an assassin and has no free will. And they end up going to this mysterious far-off land to try and recapture magic for their people. This is a very, very interesting book. I didn't love it, which was such a pity. I did find it interesting. I do want to read the second book, but there were certain aspects, so whilst trying not to spoil something, there is a death in here, and that's the only detail you'll get. But I was expecting more grief from the relationship that the characters had to each other. I was expecting more grief to be displayed than was. I was quite surprised at that, and whilst it's continuously mentioned, it just never felt like it was a grief. Instead it just felt like it was like, you did this, which was weird, like really unusual, but I really enjoyed the plot, the storyline, the way that the magic is interwoven in, the reveals that we get later on in the book. I am distressed by how the book left off. How dare they do that? What? Nah. Spoiler-free reviews. I do want to pick up the second book in the duology and finish it out, so I'm very glad that I finally delved in. We're at the penultimate book, and that is The Memory Eater by Rebecca Mahoney. This was from an unhaul from the wonderful Olivia Savannah from Olivia's Catastrophe. I had been really intrigued by the concept of this, which was that in this coastal village in the United States, there is a way for your memories to be eaten, and something goes wrong with that, and they have to solve it. And I was like, oh yeah, that'll be a fun read, and I just kept putting it off. And for some random reason, I picked it up this month. It wasn't even on my TBR, and I really enjoyed this. I think that the discussion on kind of dealing with your trauma and with your negative emotions and your bad memories was really well done, as well as kind of familial trauma and following in your family's footsteps whilst also being your own person. And this is just a fantastic YA read. I think it's really well done. I really enjoyed it, and I read like the first 25 pages one evening, and then I read the rest of it the next day. So if that tells you, this was a very absorbing book. And yeah, I don't read a lot of YA, but I'm glad that this one made it on to my shelves. And then my final book is What You Are Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama, translated by Alison Watts. My hair is in this book. That happens with everything. This one I ended up keeping. I had to go to Manchester for work on the last 3 days of the month, so I took this with me on the third to last day I read half of it, and then on the train back to New York I read the other half. I loved this. No one is surprised. The basic premise is that each chapter follows a different person, and each person ends up in this local community library, and the librarian offers them suggestions for books for what they actually stated they're looking for, and an extra book that actually really helps them with the problems that they have going on in their life right now. I adore this type of Japanese fiction so much. It brings me a lot of hope. I'm unfortunately a naturally pessimistic person. The depression doesn't help with that. Reading books like these really makes you focus on the positives of life and the joys that can be brought out. I sound like I'm spouting shite, I promise this is genuinely how this makes me feel. I adore these books so much, and this one's really well done. I did enjoy the first half more than the second, purely because I resonated more with the characters in the first half than I did in the second. In the second half, for example, there is a mother and there is an elderly retired man. Cannot relate to either of those scenarios, but regardless, I think this was really well written. I really enjoyed the concept. I believe there's a sequel and I definitely want it. This is 100% one of my favourite genres in the world, is these like mildly fantastical but primarily contemporary like discussions of life, translated from Japanese specifically, because apparently the Japanese are the best at this. And these are all 8 books that I read this month. Let me know if you've read any of these 8 books, and if so, what did you think of them? I would love to have a chat in the comments down below. And also please let me know your favourite read of January. I am not entirely sure which one mine is. I always ask this and then I don't have an answer myself. Bollocks. It might be Earthsea, you know? It might be. I really enjoyed a lot of these. It's very equal. But Earthsea might just peek out over the rest of them. Anyway, let me know your favourite for January down in the comments below. If you'd like to see what I am reading in February, that will be linked up in the cards up there. And if you want to see how I actually do with my reading, hit subscribe down below. Thank you so much for watching, folks, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!